So before we get into the lecture, let's go ahead and have a quick
What's
icebreaker.
your drink?
Today's icebreaker
Delaney.
is one way you feel policy has impacted your experience
What am I supposed to go
of
with
the
now?
built environment. Um, you know, an example of this for so here in Long Beach, there,
Revolving issue
there
is
are a lot
directed.
of parks, but the nice parks on the east side of Long Beach.
Yeah,
And
we do.
a lot of those practices happen in the early part of the 20th century, where there was a lot of race-based policy development here in the city of Long Beach. And that created a lot of park inequity. So there's Willow Park, and then there's also I cannot think of the name. Oh my gosh, it escapes me. But I cannot think of that name. That sucks. But the park, they're paid parks, right? There's and that creates a barrier sometimes to economic accessibility to spaces. And in park poor areas of Long Beach, like east on the east side of Long Beach, you really feel that impact a lot more. And then you also have spaces that are there's a lot of green space in Long Beach,
You want
but
mayonnaise or no?
built
Mayonnaise?
properly to really
You
be
like it?
utilized recreationally. Some folks may need to put their computers on mute. So that's a way that policy has impacted the built environment in my experience. Let's go to you, Isaac.
Hello.
Yes.
Hey, I'm trying to think of an example. Um, can I go next? Sorry.
Let's field it for a volunteer, a brave volunteer who wants to jump in there.
I can go, Professor.
Awesome, Carla. Thank you.
I'm not exactly sure if it's a policy, but there's something in San Diego that our canyons are protected and that there's no development that can happen in our canyons. And I find that really beneficial in San Diego because we are the most biodiverse county in North America. So protecting our canyons and our urban landscapes definitely helps all the wildlife that we're missing. And then also it connects parts of the community that that is, that sometimes you may not even know about, that there's a connection and there's that little piece of nature in like people's backyards.
Thank you for sharing that, Carla. So there's some challenges that sometimes come with policy, but there's also benefits like conservation policy that, prohibits certain developments and certain zoning areas that are designated canyons or green spaces, right? And so it doesn't always have to be bad. So even as you're thinking through this question, what ways has policy impacted your experience of the built environment? Um, it doesn't always have to be bad. It can also be a positive. So it looks like I have someone in the chat. Okay. So it's not a response to this question. Okay, we do have someone in response to this question. I feel like one way policy has impacted my experience of the built environment is through zoning regulations, which shapes the layout and function of my neighborhood and pretty much most neighborhoods. For example, policies that separate residential and commercial areas influence where I live, shop, and work, affecting how accessible or walkable my daily environment feels. That's a really great example, Abdul. Um, there are a lot more zoning policies that restrict where things can be developed, but historically, that hasn't been always regulated equitably. And so you have some communities that show that there hasn't been a lot of um, separation, right, between a lot of the industrialized factories and development that happens if even if you're talking about oil drilling and fracking, right? Some neighborhoods experience that differently. There's also whether or not you're up against commercial buildings, like you're saying, Abdul, commercial areas that are not just like malls, but you're thinking also about like auto repair facilities, things that, may have toxic waste or runoff that has an impact, a peripheral impact on the community that you find those things in. Thank you so much for sharing that example, Abdul. Anybody else want to jump in there?
I can share.
Awesome. Thank you, Maya.
So I think in my neighborhood, I'm kind of actively seeing a difference in zoning regulations because when I first moved here, it was mostly like commercial and a lot of businesses like auto repair, different like construction things. And then now slowly more and more apartment complexes are being built. So it's kind of interesting to see how all this housing's being built, but it doesn't really feel like a super walkable neighborhood because of all the existing businesses that are here. So it'll be interesting to see how things change in the future.
Thank you for sharing that, Maya. And that's an interesting thing to consider in regards to how we build our communities today. It's not just about the use now, but how that site or location will be used in the years to come. And that's a really, really good way to think about it. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Maya. Let's go to you, Sergio. Sergio Salana.
Hello. One thing I could think of right off the bat is I imagine I used to live in kind of in unincorporated LA County, so I'm guessing there maybe like there's a specific like a specific plan or some type of master plan that dictates what type of trees planted like on the boulevard. And where I used to live, it's there's like a famous street called Rear Boulevard. Um, and in that street, there's a bunch of like just like palm trees planted. But even though it kind of looks nice, I know it doesn't like provide any shade or any like real environmental benefits. So I think it would have been nicer for like maybe like a kind of like a more like some type of California native tree or one that provides more shade instead of like a palm tree. So the one that comes to mind right now.
Yes, that's a really great example, Sergio. And I really appreciate the example of understanding the jurisdiction, right? You mentioned living in an unincorporated part of the county. And so a lot of times when you're thinking about the impact of policy, understanding the jurisdiction that you're in is a big part of that, right? You know what policies you have to adhere to, whether it's within a local municipality like the city of Los Angeles, but if you're in an unincorporated area, you adhere to the policies of the county, right? And so understand those differences is really important because let's say if you wanted to address that policy or suggest a policy change or again trying to be in compliance with the policy, you want to know what jurisdiction you're in. So that's a great example. Thank you, Sergio. Who else wants to hop in there? Let's see.
I can speak about something.
Awesome.
So it's not really necessarily a policy yet, but I did recently saw that the city of Santa Ana will grant non-US citizens the right to vote in local council. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, it's kind of a controversial topic, but Santa Ana does have, I would say, a high immigrant population. So I think I don't know how I feel about it. I mean, I think it's a great idea because you're getting more voters that live in the actual city. Um, even though they're not citizens, I think they will provide great value. But yeah.
That's that's a good one. Thank you so much for sharing that. Um, so that is a really like so like who gets to participate in policy, right? Policy design, and at what parts, right? There's the voting part of the policy, and there's also like the development part of policy. But to your point, I think that voting part is a big piece, and really the idea of making sure that the people that are most impacted are getting a chance to vote. It sounds like Santa Ana as a city has a lot of folks who are residents there who may be undocumented and having them who are definitely impacted by the local government, for example, be able to participate in that local government municipality that's impacting their day-to-day lives. That sounds very innovative and foresight. But to your point, that is a very controversial topic right now. But I also think it's worth mentioning that that practice is very limited, and oftentimes it is related to local elections versus the county or state or even federal elections. It's still true that undocumented folks cannot vote in um, those elections. Thank you so much for sharing that. I see a few folks in the chat. Let's see. Philip, definitely zoning. We have a lot of single family zoning close to downtown LA and other job centers. I grew up here and had no idea how unusual this is until I visited and lived in other cities. Although the situation is improving, we are feeling the repercussions of it now with the housing affordability crisis, the increase in unhoused population, and the lack of parks. Yes, 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 and yes. Yeah, that single family zoning, again, when we're thinking about historical policy and race-based policy, a lot of that was to prevent, multifamily dwellings to be in certain areas and relegate the certain populations to certain parts of the city. But times change, right? And so as we were talking about with someone else's example, you also have to think about how a site will be used in the future. And many of those single family dwellings in downtown LA uh, over the years have been turned into multifamily dwellings, right? Apartment complexes. And you'll see that some of them are now duplexes or, have been kind of split up a bit. But to your point, historically, um, that was the challenge, right? That historical harm, and we're still dealing with the consequences to this day. You'll see that also in cities like South Pasadena, which again had heavy ordinances around single family dwellings to prevent, multifamily dwellings, which oftentimes meant families of color moving into your neighborhood. So that's a really great example. I see Melissa put something in the chat. Thank you. One policy that has significantly impacted my experience of the built environment involves zoning regulations in Via Park, Orange, I guess Orange County. Initially, developers were prohibited from building on green spaces. However, a recent vote in the last, where did I go? Where did it go? I lost it. However, a recent vote in the last election changed zoning laws, allowing development on these areas. Now I see this open green spaces being cleared and graded for new housing. While I understand the need for more housing, I deeply value green, unincorporated areas. Unfortunately, there are now fewer relaxing places to walk and unwind. Yes, that is so true. Um, this is, very consequential to the ecosystems and environment, right? And so that's why conservation, when we're thinking of, where we're developing and how we're developing is super important. And sometimes that requires the mitigation of development and landscape, right? Like how do you incorporate some of these environmental considerations within the landscape design of a site for a housing project, right? So really trying to figure out how to balance some of those constraints or conflicting goals that we're running into in regards to how do you protect the environment, but also address the housing crisis. And that can be thought through from a design perspective. But to your point, there's a lot of habitats that are being destroyed as a result of development. And when we're thinking of native plant species and native flora and fauna, that's a big part of it. But there's also the idea of the eroding coastline. Many of these coastal cities also have riparian landscapes that are very essential to the ecosystem. And a big part of the development is destroying the deltas that a lot of these creeks and rivers are falling into, destroying the marshlands, right, that are along the delta, and that completely impacts the ecosystem and also contributes to eroding of the coastal lines, right? And we have different communities here in LA, like Palos Verdes, which are falling into the ocean, right? There's literally big cracks in the middle of the street in certain neighborhoods, and many communities have lost power. There's been a lot of eroding because of the rain that record rain that we've gotten this year. So these issues are real big issues. And oftentimes the way that we develop housing, where we develop housing, where we develop parks, places, and things of that nature for recreation has a big impact on the ecosystem and ultimately ourselves. These are really good examples. Zariel, thank you for putting this in the chat. I think a policy that has had an impact in my neighborhood is the transportation accessibility. I think that there's a lack of public transit development, bike lanes, and pedestrian pathways that makes it difficult to navigate throughout the area. Yes, public transportation in the city of Los Angeles is challenging. There's a lot of improvements happening. They've been putting a lot more metro lines in, but it's a challenge. And there's a lot of space in between metro lines. So you have to, traverse bus routes and active transportation resources like bikes and scooters, right? And so addressing the need for accessibility around those things is critical. I have family members who use wheelchairs to get around, right? And it can be challenging and intimidating to traverse the community using public transportation, anxiety coming from, just the customer service aspect of it, making sure that you feel safe to use public transportation, not only in regards to public safety and being attacked, but also just making it on the ramp safely, on and off the ramp safely. So those things can be challenging and overwhelming. I really appreciate you for uplifting that, Zuriel. All right, let's take a couple of more share outs and then we'll move on. Do we have two brave folks who want to share so that we can move on? Y'all have been volunteering today. I haven't been able to pick on too many folks today. I appreciate that. I see a hand raised. Go ahead, Jorge.
Yeah, when you first asked the question, I think one that popped up right away was definitely redlining in and throughout Los Angeles County. Just right now, I had a little bit of time to research my community, and it's funny, I live 2 blocks away from the Mexican designated area, and I never knew that. So I guess it's had its lasting impact in my community, and it's weird to see that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those designations were real, There's I feel like we've probably seen a couple of them in this class. If not, I've had them in different presentations, but yeah, those documents were real. They really designated low grades to communities of color, particularly Mexican and Black communities. And oftentimes, if you were Jewish or Japanese, for example, and lived around Black folks, that will automatically make your designation low, right? So they did not appreciate diversity back then. And you still see a lot of that in the city's fabric today. Oftentimes, you'll see the segregation in LA. LA is very diverse, and I love it, but it is also very segregated in a lot of ways. And it's unique. It creates a unique experience, of culture. And when you want to, experience certain aspects of the city, you can go to Little Tokyo, you can go to Filipino Town, you can go to Cambodia Town here in Long Beach, right? And you get these experiences, but it also can be you can see the separation sometimes where some of these communities are very, very concentrated with particular groups, um, with a little mix and mingle here and there, but you can really see how segregated LA is, and it's gotten better over the years, but just think about how it was in the past. That's a really good one. Jorge, thank you for sharing that. And last share out. Who wants to be the last share out for today?
I can go.
Awesome, Rebecca. Thank you.
I guess what comes to mind for me are two different places that I grew up in. They were both more like rural areas, still cities. The first one was unincorporated until like the mid 90s, and you can see it with like the lack of infrastructure a little bit, and then kind of a hodgepodge of where things were placed as far as zoning. And then the other area, there was like a lack of funding when it came to like streets. So the streets were really, really bad. Just a lot of patching over and over again. And then later it came out there was some like, it was in San Bernardino County, and some of the people in charge were diverting those funds to other places, unfortunately. But yeah, that's what makes me think of.
Yeah, no, that's a really great example, Rebecca. I really like the idea of just, how just acknowledging how policy operates in different spaces differently. So you have the urban setting where sometimes, because of the scarcity of resources or the amount of people in a population, a lot of the rules are more strict and more clearly defined, and regulated more intensely. Whereas in more rural areas, it's a little less strict. Zoning restrictions are a little more flexible. People, like you said, hodgepodge things together to figure it out. And there's more community-centered solutions where, like, property owners collaborate for a solution versus the municipality stepping in all the time. And then you mentioned something very important, is the misappropriation of funds, which is a big part of managing politics, right? And identifying, how to redirect resources to your project. How do you, sometimes it's corrupt, right? But sometimes it's not necessarily corrupt, but just trying to figure out how to identify why your project or your initiative is most aligned to the policy priorities of a said area, right? Or a need that you identify, right? And if, for example, there's funds for it, right? Like the community clearly saw that there was a need to fund streets. And someone must have was like, hey, let's go to the local government and figure out how they can figure that out. And they end up finding out there's actually money available for it, but it hasn't been used for it, right? So that's a really great example of identifying where the resources are and how you can funnel resources using policy into your project. And you may uncover corruption. But yes, thank you so much for that example, Becca. Let's go ahead and get into our lecture. This first video that we're watching today is a great architect named Liz Akbu. And this TED Talk really talks about why they are an architect and how they use design to address social impact. and how their goal as an architect is not to build buildings, but to be a social impact person, right? So I think this is a great video because again, we're not just doing design projects. We're really using the design realm to address, equity, environmental justice, social justice, and inclusion. And so I think this video is a really great example of why she's motivated to do so. Maybe it can inspire you all. Let me know if you can hear this video. Can you all hear it? Thumbs up if you can. Can you all hear the video?
It's not playing. It's not playing, Professor.
Hi, I'm Liz, and I'm an architect. Whenever I tell people I'm an architect, one of the first questions they often ask me is whether or not I have read or seen The Fountainhead. And for those of you, clearly some of you have. Hi, I'm Liz, and I'm an architect. Whenever I tell people I'm an architect, one of the first questions they often ask me is whether or not I have read or seen The Fountainhead. And for those of you, clearly some of you have. For those of you who are familiar with it and have just now silently asked yourself this question, let me just get that out of the way. Yes, I have both read the book and seen the movie. No, I really didn't like either of them. And yes, this probably should have been some indication to me that I was well on my way to an architectural identity crisis, which then leads into the second question that I often get. What kind of buildings do you design? And for me, for the longest time, this has actually been a hard question to answer. Usually I hem and haw, and then I often say, oh, I design community centers. Partly because a lot of my work is with communities, so it's kind of true. And community centers is a typology that people can relate to, so they're like, oh yeah, great, cool. And then we move on with the conversation. But the truth of the matter is, I actually don't design community centers. And so what I wanted to try to do here today is to explain to you exactly what it is that I do. I'm an architect that doesn't design buildings. The things that I design, the things that I build, are actually opportunities for impact. So right now, you're probably asking yourself one of two questions, which I can safely say that my family, friends, and even architecture school professors have asked themselves more than once. The first is, what the heck is designing opportunities for impact? It's a good question. The second is, what kind of architect doesn't design buildings? Also a good question. By the way, that second question is often known as, wow, did she really go $75,000 into debt at a prestigious architecture school only to not practice architecture? I'm still trying to work that one out. But let me see if I can explain to you what it means to design opportunities for impact. It often means that I'm wearing one of three hats: that of the expert citizen, that of the storyteller, that of the translator. Expert citizen is this great term that I came across a couple years ago in a book called Spatial Agency, and it's a perfectly encapsulated part of what I do that I have used it religiously ever since. An expert citizen, I imagine, is many of us in this room here today. We've been trained in some type of expertise, in my case as a designer. What I love about this is the pairing with the citizen, the idea that we are still humans at the end of the day. We have emotions, we have assumptions, we have intuition. And the idea of experts often means people think of it as we're looking at things purely in the subjective way, almost scientifically. But I think it's important to remember that when you combine that human element, it's actually a really rich combination. Many of the communities that I work with, I consider to be citizen experts. Whether I'm working in a poor African American community in San Francisco or a low-income Kenyan community in Nairobi, those people know more about what it is like to live in their communities than I ever will. They know about their needs and aspirations, their successes, and their failures. And what I need to do as the expert citizen is create space at the table for them to be able to come and share that knowledge, because oftentimes they have not been empowered to see that knowledge as expertise. And so I try as much as possible to issue out an invitation in which they feel comfortable doing that. I can best describe this through the story of Mama Sama. Mama Sama and many women throughout the Global South face a problem when it comes to cooking. The traditional technology is actually a three-stone fire, and it actually creates a lot of issues, including health from the smoke inhalation and environment from the deforestation and the air pollution, and then also safety when people go out to fetch wood. Cook stoves, particularly improved cook stoves, is something that has been around for over 30 years as an effort to try and alleviate the issues that come up with the fire. And there has been a huge push from many governments and NGOs to try and rapidly increase the adoption of the cook stoves by the year 2020. Last year, when I was a fellow at IDEO.org, my colleagues and I were hired by the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves to try and investigate a way to close that gap between the adoption of the stove and the potential that it could still have. And so we spent 3 weeks in Tanzania, which was one of the target countries. We went into many homes, talked to many citizen experts, like Mama Sama, and we even cooked with them. And what we found is that many of the women actually were familiar with the idea of the cook stove. They even understood its benefits. The problem was that when it came time to cooking a lot of food for their extended family, a single cook stove was not enough. When they wanted to cook ugali, which is a traditional dish, it was just as hard to cook on a cook stove, if not harder, than cooking on a wood fire. And when it came to the cost of fuel, particularly if they were using charcoal, the cost of a month's supply of fuel was equal to 10 times the cost of a single stove. In that case, the benefits of a cook stove were not enough. And so we were sent into the field to answer the question of how could we use design to increase the adoption of the cook stove. But what we found was that adoption really wasn't the problem. Many of them owned cook stoves. They just couldn't afford to be able to use it often. And if you don't use it often, you actually can't get the benefits from it. So by taking the time to listen to Mama Sama and the other citizen experts and really understand their needs and aspirations of their daily life, what we found is that in order to generate design solutions that would be appropriate, we had to actually design from this question: how might we design for the cook and not the cook stove? It wasn't about improving the actual technology of the stove. It wasn't about increasing access to markets. It was about designing things that actually responded to the women themselves. And so we came up with a bunch of different design solutions, everything from implements that could be added to the stove to make it easier to cook, to actually creating fuel savings initiatives, something that the Global Alliance had not previously looked at. Next, I want to talk to you about being a storyteller. And through that, I'm going to tell a little bit about the story of Roberto. Roberto and his colleagues are many things. They are artisans, they are craftsmen, they are tradesmen. They are also day laborers. There are some of the over 115,000 men and women who look for a day's work for a day's wages in cities across the US every day. And the vast majority of the sites that they do it at are informal sites, meaning that they were designed for other uses. They are the street corners, the gas stations, the Home Depot parking lot. And usually at those sites, they lack even the most basic of human necessities. There's no shelter, there's no water, there's no toilets. A few years ago, I was design director at a nonprofit called Public Architecture, and my colleagues and I felt that there was something that we could do about this. But it wasn't like a day laborer was ever going to walk into our office and say, "Hi, I'm Roberto, and I'm having a problem at the corner. I could really use your help." So we actually had to go out into the streets to them, and we treated them both as our clients and as our co-designers. And the product of those conversations, several years of conversations, resulted in this: the day labor station. was a prototype semi-permanent structure that could be deployed at informal hiring sites. It was based on an idea of a kit of parts, so you could reconfigure it to meet the needs of a given site. In this case, what you see is a rather large station because it was supposed to be a proposal for a site in Los Angeles that was going to house over 150 workers. But the central elements were always the same: a seating area and pods that could house a bathroom, an office for a worksite coordinator, or even a kitchen so that you could have an income-generating food business that could help sustain the station. It was flexible in use, everything from an employment center to a classroom so that you could teach additional skills to the workers. I often get asked if by building this, was I not making it worse for Roberto and others like him? But the fact of the matter is that many of these hiring sites have been around for years, if not decades. If you think in most cities, when you go around and you're looking, there's no giant sign that's saying day laborers here. But if you were to ask anyone, they would be able to tell you, oh yeah, you go to that corner and that's where you pick them up. The fact that there is nothing there belies the fact that they are actually rather permanent. I recall Juan, who was a day laborer that I met in Houston when we were looking at building one of these there. And he said to me, I've been coming to this site for many years. It is a place in which I earn my living. It is sacred to me. But because there is nothing here, no one else sees that. And so for Juan and others like him, building this wasn't about trying to create something that would bring unwanted attention to them. It was about trying to create something that is actually emblematic of the permanence of their site and that could help actually bring dignity to them. In terms of an architectural project, this was actually a bit of a failure. We launched it right before the economic collapse, and although I flew all around the country at the invitation of cities who were really interested in this as a novel solution, when the collapse hit, as you're closing schools and cutting services, it simply was politically untenable to spend money on illegals. But that actually forced us to think about what were some of the other outcomes that came out of this. We treated this project not as a design exercise, but an opportunity to create transformation of the way in which people saw a particular type of space and saw a particular type of people. And to that end, we tried to tell the stories of Roberto, Juan, Gabriel, Leobardo, and others like them. We tried to tell the stories of them and their American dream, their desire to come here for a better life for themselves and for their families. And we tried to tell the stories of their sacred spaces, the places in which they earned a living which would support that dream. And we took that story far and wide. We took it to the Los Angeles Times, the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, the Venice Biennale. And what you see here is actually a poster from a big international award that we won for this project. And on this poster are actually quotes from emails that I received over the years from doing this project, both good and actually a lot bad. And the thing that we felt really important was that this was a catalyst for a conversation. No one was talking about these sites before. And by opening up the conversation, we were talking both what they are now and what they have the potential to be. It was also really important to tell this story not only to the wider public, but also to the workers themselves. One of my favorite moments from this project was that I had the opportunity to present it to a convention of day laborers. And yes, there is such a thing. And I only spoke for a short period of time, but after I did, many people came up to me. And I was truly touched by how touched they were at being able to see up there on that big screen something that acknowledged that they had been seen, that they had been heard, and that they had been valued. And that's the power of being a storyteller. As for the translator hat, you've actually seen that over the 10 plus minutes that I've been talking. It's basically taking the things I hear when I listen at the table and the stories that I know that I need to tell to create impact and combining them into something that is tangible, reflection of all of that, and that allows us to move forward on whatever the social issue is that I'm trying to address. And so that's what it means to design opportunities for impact. It means that I'm an expert citizen who creates space at the table for the citizen experts, that I'm a storyteller that tries to tell authentic stories of the people I meet and design with, and that I'm a translator who tries to bring tangibility to a vision of places and services that speak to the needs and aspirations of the human experience. And so I hope that if you take anything away today from my talk, well, there's sort of three things. The first is never really ask that fountainhead question to an architect. We don't like it. The other thing is that I hope that you think about architecture and design a little bit differently, about what it is and what it has the potential to impact. And the third is that the things that I've shown you are about the combination of both the hard skills of design and the soft skills of humanity. But those soft skills are not the exclusive domain of design. They can be used by all of you in anything that you're trying to do in your own lives and in your own craft. And so I hope that you move on today trying to figure out exactly how to do that. Thank you.
All right. So I really, really like this TED Talk by Liz because she gives two great examples of solutions using intense community engagement, right? Making sure that the person that had the lived experience of the issue was informing what the intervention and solutions would be. With that said, I want you all to take about 15 minutes to go through these questions and respond to them. And then we'll do a little share out. And then we'll go on a quick break. But right now, we'll take about 15 minutes to respond to these questions on the screen. Okay? So go ahead and take your time, go through these questions, 15 minutes, and we'll be right back. anyone need more time? Put your thumbs up if you need more time. All right, so folks should be coming back then. Please give me your thumbs up if you are back with me. I see a couple of thumbs up. All right, let's go ahead and get a few share outs before we head off to our first break. In Liz Ugbu's TED Talk, how does she highlight the significance of narrative in shaping policy and urban design and public spaces, and why is narrative important for driving change? Who wants to respond to this?
I can share my response to this.
Awesome, jump in there.
Yeah, so I think storytelling and narrative, like oftentimes, like that is the first step as designers. That that's what we were taught to do is create a narrative, create a story. And at the beginning, I thought at first, I was like, okay, why are we just creating stories? Why are we just creating narratives? But actually and truly, these are not just stories. They're authentic stories, lived in stories of people that we are supposed to be, or of the site we're designing for. So I think the TED Talk really brings in light of why story or narrative is important, because these are the stories that will drive change. Like, it humanizes the issues at hand. It builds empathy. It ensures solutions are grounded into real life experiences. Kind of like what she spoke about with the day laborers. I think she's able to change the dominant perception of them by creating that. And it just highlights like the human stories behind it.
Thank you so much, Carla, for that response. Definitely so. Narratives definitely inform in a way that's very important, and could really bring insight that you otherwise would not have, you know. Does anybody else want to respond to this question?
Yes.
All right, Jorge.
For me is important because, like Carla said, there's a lot of understanding of how aesthetic things can look, or how minimalist they can look, or how beautiful they can look. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't serve the main purpose, which is us, the people, um, what's the point of having such beautiful designs, right? A clear example can be some of the museums in Mexico City. They're really beautiful. They're amazing, but they are mainly serving tourists and people that live in these extremely wealthy areas, right? But people from Mexico City, it's not going to those places because getting a coffee it's $10 or more, right? But that's my opinion. Just a reminder of why are we deciding, right? Or and who are these designs for?
Yes, yes. Who is this going to benefit? You know, that's a really big question. And it needs to be a part of the design process, right? Who are you thinking of when you're thinking of economic opportunity, right? Who are you thinking of when you're thinking of who's going to visit or experience the site? Um, and what will that experience be like for that particular, group or that demographic? And that's powerful insight there. And like you pointed out, sometimes designs don't have that foresight, and you can see it in the ways that the surrounding community or people that come from that city are experiencing it versus, like you said, folks who may be wealthy or the tourists that oftentimes come to these communities and these cities and benefit from that experience, being able to take their pictures, have their tours, and then leave the area without experiencing the day-to-day lives of everyone that's from that area. Thank you for sharing that, Jorge. Let's go to the next question. How does meaningful community engagement demonstrate the need to design inclusive and equitable landscapes and public spaces? And what are some real world examples of this in action? You can discuss this in context of something that you've experienced or something that even came out in the video that Liz Upbull mentioned.
I can go, Professor.
Go ahead, Manuel.
Yeah. So I think it like a meaningful community engagement can demonstrate the need, for inclusive and equitable landscapes because like for me, like in my studio, like we're designing for a local community and they've for a long time they've never really been heard. They've been like underserved and marginalized. So just, I mean, we didn't personally talk with them, but understanding like their needs and what they came up with, like the issues they came up with, was like really important on how like we were deciding what we were going to design, what we were going to do, and if that actually reflected what the people, the local residents actually wanted, and if we could actually also implement what they wanted and just kind of finding that balance. So I think that that would be at least, well, that's my little like real world example. But I think that meaningful community engagement is really important for that.
Thank you, Manuel. Yes, it's super critical. And it's important to be reflective of, let's say the community, because once the design comes out, the community will experience that, right? And they'll know from that experience if it was built for them or not, if it is reflective of, let's say, the conversations that were had, the engagement that was conducted, or the lack thereof, right? And oftentimes, many projects have to go back and invest thousands, millions of dollars sometimes to fix issues with the design because they failed to do that community engagement. So the more you can do that engagement across stakeholder groups, right? Even thinking of like, let's say policy, right? Legislative challenges are a legislative alignment, right? Because it's going to have to go through the local government policy process, right? It's going to have to go through the approvals of building and safety. It's going to have to be in compliance with city planning ordinances, right? So ensuring that you're doing that due diligence is going to be critical. And then in regards to the impacted demographic, ensuring that, again, the outcome goals of your project reflect their needs and reflect the solutions that they identified in relation to their needs, right? That's really, really big. Thank you so much for sharing that, Manuel. It looks like Melissa put something in the chat. Narrative plays a crucial role in driving change because it focuses on designing solutions that truly meet public needs for those outside, let me see, outside of the affected group to build or support day labor centers. They are driving change because it focuses on designing solutions that truly meet the public needs. Okay. Okay. They must understand the specific needs of these individuals. As she says, we need to tell the story of these sacred places. Meaningful community engagement has shown that inclusive and equitable public spaces bring dignity for people. For example, in the case of Mama Soma, it was essential to recognize that a single cook stove couldn't cater to the entire family, making it impractical. Additionally, even when they had a cook stove, it was costly to operate. It still didn't meet the family's needs. Therefore, community engagement is vital to fully understand how new, more sustainable cookware can benefit these women in their communities, right? Yeah, so that's a critical part of engagement. You can't say that you're helping somebody, but providing them with a tool that they cannot use or that is not conducive to their needs, or the scale of need, right? It's like giving someone one egg when they need a whole dozen eggs to feed their family, right? So it's just not meeting the need. So this is a great example. Thank you for sharing that, Melissa. Anybody else want to respond to the second question before we move on?
I can share.
Awesome, Rebecca.
So I recently went to a community engagement event and kind of as a member of the community. And there was a community leader there who expressed like a pretty important need and concern that was not being discussed or kind of included in the method that they were using for the community engagement, like the people who had organized it. And I found that kind of interesting that there was kind of like this disconnect between the people that were organizing the event and then the people who lived in the community who were expressing a need, that there wasn't a way really for them to demonstrate that given like the way the engagement was set up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so being effective, right? Ensuring that you create a process of engagement that achieves the insight that you need. And then again, that you can be responsive to it. There are sometimes barriers and constraints that come up in relation to what you actually can do, right? We know that, like in the case of the cook stove, there was a lot of challenges that they were trying to address in regards to health, right? Health risks, health impact, but they weren't addressing some of the usability challenges that their cookware was bringing up. And like you said, Rebecca, that insight is super critical because again, it's pointless to do anything that the end user cannot do anything with. Let's go to the third question. What role does collective impact um, what roles does collective impact achieved through partnerships and collaborations play in ensuring successful policy or urban design interventions? Can you think of cases where partnerships has made a difference?
I can answer that one.
All right.
So I was thinking about it relating to the reading we had with the Kabira project
Okay.
and how they were discussing the collaboration with the community-based groups and how those groups helped provide technical skills for building the actual project, but they also helped establish trust between the community and the design group. So I think when you involve multiple partnerships, it helps bring up a more diverse skill set and resources and a more successful collaboration.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. It reminds me of a lecture from a previous lecture we had where we were discussing the different like the different technology needed to also teach and learn from impacted communities, right? So you have to teach them the process, teach them different frameworks, but also learn from them at the same time. So that technical assistance piece is really critical, so that they can actually really partner at a level that's at scale, right? And so sometimes that requires bringing in stakeholders who have that expertise of engagement to teach them those new skills. And like you said, having a partner sometimes allows trust to be built more effectively because many times these community-based organizations already have the rapport with community members. And so if you are an outsider design firm or even let's say local government, which doesn't have like a healthy historical relationship with that community. Having a community partner allows you to leverage that trust building factor that's really needed. So yeah, no, thank you so much for bringing that example up, Maya. That's a perfect example. Anybody else want to share in relation to the collective impact question? May, do you want to jump in there? Feel free to respond in the chat, May, or come off of mute. Let's go to you, Nestor. Yes, we are on the third question, May. Nestor, do you want to respond? Let's do third time's a charm. Let's go to you, Philip. You got some quiet folks on the call tonight. I've called on May, Nestor, or Philip. Either of you want to respond?
Uh, I'm sorry, which question are we on? I just had something for a second. Number 3?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's some now like usage of the what do I say this like of the shore of the LA River. They're kind of in Frogtown, Legion Valley. I think that um, it was really neat to see how there's kind of like local stakeholders. So there were people who would just kind of go down there and canoe just to prove a point or something. And then now, when you walk by there, they're like kind of businesses um, fronting the bike path. Definitely like money has been put into improving the bike path there and also there's like a really nice bridge at some point there across the river. Actually, there's a couple that are just for like pedestrians and bikes. And also you see some parks going to come online along there too. So in this case, it was really good that the agencies with the city were kind of able to collaborate with like kind of the local stakeholders there, and so both like residents and business, and also people who are there for recreation, right? To sort of start to at least make make some improvement there, because now it's like at least somewhat of a usable public space.
Yes, that's a really great example, Philip. Collective impact is definitely reflective in Frogtown, and it really does touch on, let's say, the social, economic, and environmental components. Um, Social determinants of health in regards to, active transportation and health and fitness with the bike path. But they've done a really good job with creating opportunities for economic, um, opportunities for local businesses where they, situated businesses along that bike path in a very unique way, right? To drive that economic opportunity. And then, like you mentioned, there's parks, and they've done a really good job in relation to sustainability in context of the parks as well as the river, right? The idea of, I believe a section of that part of the river is soft bottom. So there's some restorative justice going on in regards to sustainability factors for the river, and restoring habitats there. But also in regards to the urban landscape, there's infrastructure like water runoff, rain gardens, and water capture in the different parks and how they're built to withstand flooding in the different communities and areas along the river, in regards to how they're set up. And then those then create riparian spaces for different flora and fauna to thrive off long after the rain has gone, right? So yeah, that's a really great example, Philip. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's go ahead and wrap it up with the last question. We'll take a couple of volunteers for the last question. How do established frameworks and processes help streamline research, stakeholder engagement, and the policy and design process? And how do they help ensure that outcomes are inclusive and effective? We've been using a lot of frameworking to think through case studies, right? And so, identifying challenges, solutions, values, the different stakeholders that are represented. How have those frameworks helped you all do that? And how do you think that helps, identify gaps of inclusion or opportunities there? Let's have a few volunteers if we can get them. But I got some folks that I want to pick on if we can't get any volunteers. Let's go to you, Williams. You might need to go in the chat because, yeah, no, feel free to respond in the chat or verbally. Let's see. Williams, ready to go. That's what I appreciate. Establish frameworks and processes help streamline research and stakeholder engagement and policy and design by providing structured approaches for gathering input, analyzing data, and coordinating efforts among diverse groups. They ensure inclusivity by establishing clear communication, collaboration, and enabling underrepresented voices to be heard. Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Williams, for being ready. That's what that little time beforehand, that 15 minutes is for y'all to respond to these. So our debriefs and conversations could be a little more streamlined. So thank you for being ready, Williams. But yeah, your response is really spot on. Frameworks help you have that 30,000-foot view always ready to go. So you kind of know generally what questions you want to ask, which may, again, have unique results because each case is different. But you generally want to know who the stakeholders are, what the main issue is, and how the stakeholders may see the issue differently, right? Those are really big things that you want to uncover. But you also want to identify the different solutions or values, right, that these different stakeholders may have. But on the backdrop of that, right, the frameworks we have also help identify policy considerations, which is super critical with all the work that you'll be doing as designers, right, in the public domain. It's really critical that you're in alignment with policy constraints. And then you also are able to effectively communicate those expectations throughout your process through the stakeholders involved. So this is a really great response, Williams. Let's have one more person share out. I got my eyes on you, Yael. You want to jump in real quick?
Yeah, so I think that whenever like that framework and those processes relate to the actual community, I feel that that's when the outcomes can be inclusive and like effective to the community that's gonna be at some point the user of that space. Like also like I think the frameworks and the process basically just help to have like a more organized kind of approach. That way it becomes easier for like the stakeholders to engage in the design and what is it? The design and the policy. Oh yeah.
Could be policy indoor design, right? So yeah, that's good. Thank you so much for your response, Ayo. Yes, it's super important to be effective. A lot of times you're on these projects that have timelines, right? You don't have, forever to implement something. So your frameworks and processes allow you to create timelines for your project and know, okay, between the next 3 months, I want to have these 3 parts of my framework completed. I want to have a better understanding of who the stakeholders are, what type of solutions they're envisioning for the project. Think about what types of policy constraints you need to be mindful of in regards to your site, right? Environmental constraints. Are there any social challenges in your community that you need to be mindful of? There might be fractions of the community that want a different type of use for the site, right? And being mindful of those type of uh, challenges that come up, right? And how those may impact what you're trying to achieve in regards to your design. So having that mindfulness in regards to your frameworks allows you to have those considerations within the time frame that you need them so that you can address any of those challenges as needed through engagement or clarification of policy constraints and how that confront some of those expectations or challenges that are coming up from the stakeholders, and then really really try to find that alignment piece, right? So with your project you want to really figure out how are your stakeholders aligned. That policy window gives you the authority that you need, and then that helps you drive your actions that you'll take with your design, and then you'll be able to assess the impact over time, right? Because that's the other thing. Once you implement your design, you want to make sure that it withstands the test of time, right? The usage of the site will be experienced by the end user. And you need to have those checkpoints to understand, if your site is actually operating as intended. Are there gaps that, you could only really figure out until the site was in use? And now you can, modify and adapt based off of how the site is being used. So those are different things that you want to be mindful of. So with that said, let's go on our 5-minute break and then we'll come back around 7:33. Thank you all for participating. All right, we should be making our way back. Give me your thumbs up if you are back with me. Awesome, awesome. Let's get right back into it. We've been talking about different frameworks, right? And the community engagement process requires a lot of organizing to ensure that you're doing the right activities, but also you're collecting the information that you need, right? I have a moth right here that is gonna annoy me until I kill it, but I don't think I've gotten it yet. I don't want to kill it, but it's okay. I want to, yeah, whatever. Forgive me for that. That's probably gonna annoy me. So okay, it's attracted to my light right now. But okay. So understanding policy development frameworks. Let's put design right here, but we're really thinking of this in context of policy as well, because again, policy is a big part of what we're aligning to. But when we're discussing our engagement with impacted stakeholders, right, you want to be able to create these spaces. And we talked about what these spaces look like. They can be working groups, they can be virtual spaces. You can conduct surveys, but you really want to find ways to discuss your design ideas in relation to your target demographic. There's oftentimes research that can be conducted as well. We talked about community-based organizations, right? So oftentimes those community-based organizations may have reports that they've conducted, engagement that they've conducted with community around the issue areas that you're focusing on, right, related to your design. And that helps you understand how they may feel about your project. There's also, again, when you're working in collaboration community, you really want to give them opportunities to participate in the actions that are taking place. So when you're developing your design ideas, there may be opportunities to align to policy. You may want to start a subcommittee on policy research and ensuring that we understand, like, let's say zoning restrictions related to your site, or the types of plants you can or cannot plant there, right? Because many cities have requirements around the types of trees and plants that you can plant. Also, you want to think about the design implementation committee. A lot of times folks like to come up with the design part, right? But it's like, okay, well, who's going to implement it? And some, as a designer, you're the architect of the process, but there may be a design build group that implements the design, right? So you really want to have your ducks in order so that, once you hand it off to the build team, the design build team, they're ready to do the work, the contractor, right? And then there may be opportunities to, when we're talking about even developing that strategic alignment to policy, there may be opportunities to come up with what that outline should be. Who are the stakeholders that need to be engaged? So if it's a design firm, if it's an elected official, to better understand, okay, how can we make sure that this policy is in strategic alignment to this initiative? They may have an initiative on green space development aligned to their initiative at the local level. So you want to say, okay, cool, this effort can go to the effort of planting 100 trees, right? If they have this goal to plant trees, you can say that this project can contribute 100 trees to that plan in this designated area, right? And what your project probably is in one of the areas that need the green space the most, right? So being able to draw those strategic alignments to your project is really, really critical. And it really drives the conversation. Again, when you're a particular stakeholder, let's say as a designer, an architect, and you're not really at the implementation of the building phase, you want to ensure that your insight is well felt in that phase, right? So this is similar to like a policy implementation proposal. Your design is the proposal for what the site should look like and how it should operate. But like, let's say a landscape contractor is who implements the landscape architectural design. That's a total different license, right? So being able to provide a design that is in compliance, which with whatever regulatory requirements, let's say a contractor needs to adhere to, that's going to be important so that when you do that handoff of your design, again, that contractor can go ahead and implement it without issue. So what are you trying to figure out in your design? You want to know, like, what are you trying to accomplish with your design? How will you know that your changes, the changes that you're trying to address have improved? And what changes can we make or you make that will result into that improvement, right? And so that's really where you're talking about the site analysis. You're thinking of how can you enhance the site in response to the stakeholders' goal? So it's like, what can you plan? What can you do? What are you studying? And what actions will you take, right? So this is like a feedback loop that you're conducting. as you're doing the engagement with your stakeholders, the community, there may be parts of the process that they're not going to be able to facilitate, right? Like um, within your internal company, they may not have access to your data team. So you have to take the insight that you receive from the community stakeholder and give it to your data teams for them to do whatever work they need to do with it, right? So being able to map all that out, understand how that relates to your stakeholders' input, and then how that then results in the actions that you took, that's going to be critical because you're going to have to report that back to the community, right? They're going to want to know, what did you do with that information that I gave you yesterday? All the time that we took, the activity that you conducted with me, the brainstorming that we did, the visit that we had with the elected official. What did you do with that information, and how was that informing what actions you took, right? So you really want to be able to articulate that. So again, when you're doing all of this work, it can get really overwhelming sometimes as far as like, what part of the process are we in? What are we conducting? So again, when you're working with the community, you're really trying to leverage what Liz Igbo, she mentioned the expert citizen, working with citizen experts, right? So that part is that that narrative insight that you're getting from the impacted community. And that really allows you to identify those barriers and opportunities in the existing system. And when we're talking about the existing system, that's when we're uncovering, let's say zoning restrictions or historical zoning practices that have caused the outcome of the issue that you're facing. Today we were talking about the LA River with some of the examples that you all were discussing. The LA River has come a long way, but for a long time, there was a lot of work done by organizations like Friends of the LA River, collecting narrative strategies, narratives from impacted community members along the river, where they were able to, again, identify those barriers and opportunities that were reflective of some of the existing zoning issues and practices, or the historical harm caused by eminent domain practices, right? And the river is owned or managed by the federal government. It's a waterway. So understanding jurisdiction is also important, because then you have to understand how that, impacts constraints, right? Those barriers or constraints within the existing system. And so that allows you to investigate challenges, successes. There may be things that are going right in regards to that. Let's say, because it's the federal government, it has to be in compliance with EPA, right? So is there any policies related to the EPA that you can draw into your goals for, like, let's say an LA River project, that helps you, gain some authority in your proposed action for your projects? And that then allows you to, empowers you to develop those solutions, because you've done the work to align it to the community's vision, right? You understand where the barriers are coming from, and you also understand how your solutions are in alignment to policy empowerment, because you really want to, again, the policy, I always say, gives you authority. So if you can find a authority in the policy alignment that really, outside of political will and, again, stakeholder alignment, policy authority is a big one. But again, once you identify those solutions, your intervention for your design, that then should be responsive to the barriers that you identified, right? And you can leverage that insight, because again, you may not be the stakeholder that's the decision maker. You, as the architect, you do the design, but you may not be the funder of the project, right? As an architect, you do the design, but you may not be the the backbone agency, right? So you really have to figure out your role and understand how your role is informing the decision makers through policy proposals, structural changes, or even design, right? Design solutions. And there may be programmatic aspects of your site. When we're talking about being able to say, you need to have a component of the site that's dedicated to economic opportunity, because that's an area of opportunity that came up from community stakeholders, right? And that also will create drawing alignment to the city. That will create economic opportunity for the city, tax revenue and things of that nature, due to the fact that economic activity is happening on this site. So being able to draw those strategic alignments, not only to your stakeholders' needs, but also to the landscape of policy constraints or considerations. But lastly, you always want to have that feedback loop. Like I mentioned earlier, you're going to always have that piece of reality where there might be blind spots, right? You have all the good intentions to have the most optimal design, and you completed your design, and folks started to experience it and realize that the landscape design was really good, but the material used for the playground, for example, gets too hot during the summer, and kids is getting burnt up, right? So you're like, oh, we're gonna have to repaint it with heat resistant paint, right? So really being able to have that feedback loop within your design to say, okay, there were some gaps there, but we can always employ the narrative strategy to understand how our impacted target demographic is experiencing the end user experience, right? And how that can inform any modifications or changes to your design so that it can be more conducive to the needs or experiences that you're expecting your end user to have, right? So again, this also helps you keep yourself as well as the stakeholders on track. If we're talking about solutions and folks are still talking about identifying barriers, you can say, great, that's a great addition to the barriers that we identified. Is it okay for us to move on to continuing to talk about solutions now, right? It keeps you on track as far as monitoring where you are in the conversation and holds people accountable to making progress towards your end goal. And so this is your landscape, your legislative canvas, and this is like your cheat sheet to know, like, okay, you've touched all your bases. You've been able to identify challenges across stakeholder groups. You've identified the solutions proposed across stakeholder groups. You know the values that are essential across stakeholder groups, right? You understand the systems, right? We've been using the research tool, right? Understanding the social considerations, economic considerations, environmental considerations, as well as those constraints, right? So you've done the research on that. This allows you to say, okay, we know what some of those existing system barriers are, zoning restrictions, city planning policies and ordinances that have caused historical harm. But you also can identify policy windows. These may be initiatives that, let's say, a city or a county is really pushing towards, and you can build your design in alignment to that, right? And that'll help you say, we're in support of this initiative of planting 1,000 trees in the next year or 5 years, right? And this project is in alignment with that. But again, you are using this cheat sheet to chart all of these resources that you have and account for all of this insight that you've received. So again, existing systems, you can account for any of the existing systems that are contributing to the challenges that your issue is identifying. And then policy window is any existing policy opportunities that are in alignment to the solutions that are being proposed across your stakeholder groups. Landscape mapping, this is a big one, right? So you're understanding, okay, there's all of these different stakeholders, but you understand that your end user is really who you're trying to speak to in relation to your end goal and your design. So you're looking at who is your target demographic? Who are the adversaries? Either stakeholders who, may not be as happy about this outcome goal. There may be developers who want to use more of the site or want to use it for something else. But you also understand who your champions are. There may be legislative champions, community stakeholders who are champions. But it's really important for you to know who your target demographic is for benefit. So it may be business owners because you have an economic component that's driving the site. It may be local families because you have a social determinants of health component around using the site for, community wellness. There'll be a fitness center on the site or the different equipment that you can work out on. There'll be a walking trail around the site. Whatever those components are, you want that to be in alignment to your stakeholders. And then also the idea of environmental constraints, right? Your the environment, I feel as a landscape architect should always be a stakeholder. So I also want you all to be thinking of not only the different, stakeholders as far as like human stakeholders, but I also want you to think about the environment as a stakeholder. And that's, maybe different flora and fauna that you're trying to account for as far as them having a better experience. Maybe it's a restorative issue on your site. Maybe it's the monarch butterfly. But whatever it is, I want you all to really be thinking of the environment as a stakeholder as well. And then we get to developing our narrative, right? We'll be talking more about this as we continue with this course, but developing our narrative is really important because throughout your project, you're going to be uncovering conflicts between different stakeholder groups. And that may be information that you can use to mitigate some of those conflicts through your design considerations. You also want to know what characters are identified. Again, who are all the stakeholders? How do people of color experience systems differently? Are people experiencing things differently because of their ability? It may not just be color. It may also be because of their ability. It may be because of their gender, their sexuality, their religion, right? Are people experiencing the current site in a particular way or having a certain experience with your site as of now because of any of these things? Or do they just have a perceived experience of that, right? Like, has this community have historical harm related to these issues? And what are the values and ideologies that you're uncovering, right? From the different stakeholders that are supporting these experiences. It could be lack of investment, right? So these are the things you really want to be thinking through, right? And this is how you want to leverage these frameworks to ensure that you keep the conversation moving forward, that you're accounting for all of the considerations that you need in regards to your project. And that, again, strengthens your outcomes and strengthens the considerations that you make. And then again, you just really want to be able to effectively communicate to each of your stakeholders that you listen to them, right? You want to be able to, your stakeholders to feel like they see themselves in your considerations, even if they're not ultimately what they desire, but that you considered them, okay? So right now, I want us to look at this video that really talks about the policymaking process, because again, it is an important factor as we continue to line up our design considerations.
The policy-making process. Public policies don't create themselves. Rather, many groups, both public and private, contribute to what is known as the policy-making process. The policy-making process is the process by which policy comes into creation and evolves over time in the American government system. Before we get into the system itself, let's go over some vital vocabulary to aid us in our discussion. The political agenda consists of issues that people believe require governmental action. Issues that are currently on the political agenda include things like the legality of abortion and gun control. A cost is a burden that people believe they must bear if a policy is enacted. Cost can be any burden, whether it is a literal monetary cost or a non-monetary cost. A benefit is a satisfaction that people believe they will enjoy if a policy is adopted. Similar to a cost, a benefit can be monetary, but it doesn't have to be. Process regulations are rules that govern commercial activities. They are designed to improve consumer, worker, or environmental conditions. Now, there are 5 types of public policy. A congressional statute is a law passed by Congress. A presidential action is a decision by a president, mostly influencing organizations under the executive branch. A court decision is an opinion of the Supreme Court or other court. A budgetary choice is legislative enactment of taxes and/or expenditures. A regulation is when an agency adopts a rule. These forms of public policy are created through the policymaking process. The first and most important step is agenda setting, which happens when public attention focuses on a public problem or issue. Public officials can contribute by using words and actions to aim attention. From there is policy formation. This is when policymakers in the legislatures and bureaucracy take up the issue. They create legislative, regulatory, or programmatic strategies to address the problem. Once the policy is formulated, then it is time for policy adoption. This is when policymakers formally adopt a policy solution, usually in the form of legislation or rules. After that is policy implementation, which government agencies begin the job of making the policy work by establishing procedures, writing guidelines, or issuing grants and aid to other government agencies. Once the policy is implemented, it goes on to policy evaluation. This is the viewing of the policy from both inside and outside the government to determine if the policy is addressing the problem it originally set out to resolve. From here, the policy can go into revision. This is an optional step based on what was decided in policy evaluation. Revision is when the policy is changed or corrected to improve the outcomes. The beginning of this process can be viewed in this political cartoon. It shows the unethical practices of the drug and food industry during the early 20th century. Political cartoons such as this helped set the political agenda and caused Congress to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. This act prohibited dangerous additives and inaccurate labels in the manufacturing of food and drugs, and later aided in the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. While a policy is created to solve a problem for a group of people, someone has to pay for its implementation. There are 4 main kinds of politics and relationships between whom a policy benefits and whom it costs. First is majoritarian politics. This is a policy in which almost everybody benefits and almost everybody pays. Interest group politics is a policy in which one small group benefits and another small group pays. Client politics is a policy in which one small group benefits and almost everybody pays. Entrepreneurship politics is a policy in which almost everybody benefits and a small group pays the cost. In entrepreneurship politics, there is what is known as policy entrepreneurs. Policy entrepreneurs are activists who can either be in or out of government, who pull together a political majority on behalf of unorganized interest. These 4 types of politics can be viewed easily in this diagram. The size of the government is always increasing. The national government often adopts policy ideas that were originally pioneered by state and local governments. The creation of new agencies and policies allow for the scope of the government to grow further. As said by President Gerald Ford, a government big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take from you everything you have. Officials have a variety of motivations to create policies. While many policies are created out of altruism for the general public, there are 2 other frequent motivations behind policy making. The first is known as pork barrel legislation. This is legislation that gives tangible benefits to its constituents in several districts or states in hopes of winning their votes in return. Due to being able to be re-elected an unlimited number of times, congressmen are constantly trying to please their constituents to aid them in their next election. There is also what is known as log rolling. This is when a legislator supports a proposal favored by another congressman in return for support on his or her piece of legislation. This is like a congressman saying, I will support your policy if you support mine. To recap, let's do a self-check. True or false? Entrepreneurial politics cannot occur without the leadership of a policy entrepreneur. You have
True or false? Entrepreneurish politics cannot occur without leadership of a policy entrepreneur. Thumbs up for true, thumbs down for false. You could also put it in the chat. So Manuel says true. Yael says true. Okay, we have a few trues. Carter says true. Jorge says true. Let's
10
see.
seconds. The correct answer is false. It can occur with or without such leadership. Let's try another. True or false? The bureaucracy reacts to policy, but is not a source of policy. You have 10 seconds.
The bureaucracy reacts to policy, but is not a source of policy. True or false? Thumbs up for true, thumbs down for false. Let's see. One thumbs up. Folks is a little scared now, huh? The first one didn't go too well. No responses in the chat as of yet for this one. Let's see what happens. Okay, Philip says false. Let's see.
The correct answer is false.
All right,
Increasingly, the
right.
bureaucracy is a major source of policy innovation. Now, let's try some multiple choice style questions.
Multiple
The
choice
most
is a little
important
bit better.
decision that affects policymaking and least noticed is the decision to A. Enact the policy agenda, B. Determine what to make the policy about, C. Enforce the policy agenda, D. Fund the policy agenda.
So what are y'all thinking? The most important decision that affects policymaking and least noticed is the decision to what? Enact the policy agenda, determine what to make the policy about, enforce the policy agenda, fund the policy agenda. Yeah, I would say it's between A and C. That implementation piece is oftentimes forgot about. Folks get so excited with when the policy passes and forget, oh, we got to implement this or we got to fund it. But usually funding is considered before a policy is passed. So let's see. Is it A, B, C, or D?
Or E. Fund and enforce the
Or E?
policy agenda.
Fund
You
and
have
enforce.
15.
Okay, so E. E says fund and enforce. I would say E. Low key, E is looking pretty. Yeah, I would say E.
seconds.
Let's see what happens.
The correct answer is B. Determine what to make policy about.
Determine what
Let's
to
try
make
another.
about.
An example of a policy characterized by distributed benefits and distributed cost is A. A tariff on bicycle chains, B. Farm subsidies, C. Dairy subsidies, D. The construction of a dam, or E. Increased Social Security benefits. You have 15 seconds.
All right, 15 seconds. A, B, C, D, or E. Policy characterized by distributed benefits.
The correct answer is E. Increase
Right?
Social Security benefits.
A lot of folks say eat good job.
Through the 6 steps of agenda setting, policy formulation, adoption, implementation, evaluation, and revision, policies are created.
Boom. So there's a few questions I want y'all to consider. The importance of policy alignment. How can aligning design interventions with existing policies ensure that the landscape architect projects address broader social, environmental, and economic goals within the community? Why is it critical for landscape architects to understand and incorporate policy frameworks into their designs? And how can this enhance project approval, funding opportunities, and long-term sustainability? In what ways does identifying policy alignment help landscape architects navigate regulatory constraints while creating innovative and inclusive spaces that serve diverse populations? And lastly, how can landscape architects effectively manage stakeholder expectations throughout the design process to ensure that their final intervention meets community needs while balancing regulatory and environmental constraints? So we'll take about 15 minutes and come back at 8:21. But I'll give y'all some time to respond to this question, and we'll do share outs when we come back. Any questions before we break out? All right, well, let's take the 15 minutes and we'll be back. All right, we should be coming back. Thumbs up if you are back with me. All right. All right, so let's have some folks share out real quick. Do we have any volunteers? Do we have any volunteers? Who wants to respond to the first question? How can aligning design interventions with existing policies ensure that landscape architecture projects address broader social, environmental, and economic goals within the community?
I could share it.
Awesome, Chase. Thank you.
I was saying that it could help align with the existing policies to ensure the product addresses a broader and social, economic, environmental scale, as it can help drive the narrative for the actual project itself. So that these policies can kind of give like a foundational baseline of an understanding of what's going on in that community, and also like the rules and regulations, not only in the state but also in the county.
Awesome. Yes, that's spot on. It's super critical to be able to communicate that in context of your site, because policies differ not only within different municipalities, but even different areas within that municipality may have different zoning restrictions, environmental restrictions. So having that clarity is important. And then that also helps you manage that social component as far as like what stakeholders want to see. You can manage that in context of those regulations. So yes, great response, Chase. Anybody else want to respond to question number one? So the class is thinned out a bit, but let's go to you, Sergio. Do you have a response to question number one?
Sure. So I guess from my professional planning background, I will look at it from firstly, I would look at if there's maybe like a neighborhood plan or specific plan. I would look into that. Maybe in those type of plans, there exists kind of maybe like some type of goals already identified from city officials, and then kind of use that as like a starting point on, I guess, kind of seeing what the community's needs and wants, and from there, kind of try to formulate maybe some type of intervention, whether it be like in landscape architecture or maybe that's more policy oriented. And then, yeah, because that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Sergio. Great response. And those general plans or community plans oftentimes give insight in context of like if it's in a evacuation zone for a tsunami or if it's in a flood zone, right? So those considerations can help, what type of a design you want to have or what type of considerations you want to make in that regard. So yes, great response in regards to leveraging existing documents. General plans, community plans oftentimes are long-term documents. They're in place for several decades, right? So understanding what the vision of that community is in context of those plans is really, really important. And sometimes you may be doing a project at a time where they're updating those plans, right? And that can also be a great insight gatherer in regards to what you should be considering when those general plans are being updated too. So great response. Let's go to number 2. Why is it critical for landscape architects to understand and incorporate policy frameworks to their designs, and how can this enhance project approval, funding opportunities, and long-term sustainability? In the video, it talked about the different types of policy, right? And talks about how budgeting is also a part of the policy process. So how can your design be in alignment in a way that kind of sets up your project for enhancement in context of those different opportunities? We haven't heard from you yet, Jamie. Do you want to jump in there real quick?
For question 2,
Yes.
I think it's critical for landscape architectures to incorporate policy frameworks from the beginning, as it helps like streamline like all of the approvals and ensure that the project is compliant with regulations. And I think doing so just reduces the amount of delays in the project.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much for that. It definitely does, right? If you're mindful of the different policy considerations you need to have throughout your project and understand at different points of the project, you may have different touch points with different branches of what that policy or regulatory components may be. And planning that out up front is really important. And then also, when you're talking about budget and budget allocations, oftentimes having that plan laid out properly just puts you in a prime position to access those budget resources when they're made available. And being able to communicate how your project is responsive to those budget considerations or budget priorities is really important, right? So yeah, great response, Jamie. Thank you so much for your participation. Let's have one more response to question number 2, and then we'll move on to 3. Let's see, who have we heard from? Everyone here has spoken, so let's start the rotation back over. Let's go to you, May. Do you have a response for question number 2?
Yeah, I guess for number 2, incorporating policy framework, it makes it easier to attract funding and also receive public support, which can ensure long-term sustainability for the project.
Indeed. I think long-term sustainability is super critical because sometimes, like, like a programmatic project, it's easier to understand why there needs to be ongoing funding for it. But if you're talking about landscape design or maintenance of a landscape project, you want to be mindful of what that long-term sustainability looks like. And that's even one of the reasons why here in our region, having a native flora and fauna is a little more sustainable, because oftentimes it has its own cycle that it goes through during its bloom season and when it goes dormant. So those things are important to be mindful of, especially when you're talking about long-term sustainability of a project, right? So yes, great response, mate. Thank you for sharing. Let's go to question number 3. In what ways does identifying policy alignment help landscape architects navigate regulatory constraints while creating innovative and inclusive spaces that serve diverse populations? So that balancing act, how does it help architects manage the balance? Let's go to you, Philip.
Yes. So identifying policy alignment often will incentivize the regulatory agencies to work with the landscape architects to navigate constraints they've created, right? So for example, like if you want to do interventions at an LAUSD school, they have, people who kind of, how do I say this, establish kind of an overall repertoire of what they want to see. Right. And so when you partner with those, you'll find that, like, I've seen, like, when you partner with those people from the beginning, they help you kind of make your design work and fit what they need. And if you kind of come to them with something out of thin air, right? Like off the street, they're like, why didn't you consult us? This is all wrong. Not going to get approved. So it really yeah, it makes the agency more receptive, and also now you have their ears. So now you can actually kind of present your data and arguments, right, to justify those interventions that you want.
Indeed, indeed. And sometimes it does policy and regulatory compliance on your end helps manage expectations of your client or even, the community as well, right? Sometimes the issue at hand is in context of what policies exist already. And sometimes community or may want to respond to um, the site in a way as if a policy uh, in regards to a policy that doesn't exist right now, right? So being able to manage expectations and talk about what can happen right now, in context of what policies exist now and what regulatory compliance exists now, versus thinking of it in context of what may happen in the future, in regards to policy, because that can be great for like idea building, but at some point you have to bring it to ground level and say this is what we can move forward with given the policy constraints that exist now, right? And sometimes for a client that's maybe a private client, they may have something that they want to do on their site that they're not permitted for. And so you have to be able to say, hey, we can't build that within the current constraints that we have. This project won't be approved through building and safety if X, Y, and Z is not in place, right? So being able to hold your client accountable to their goals and vision in context of policy constraints is super important. It's like, we can't do it this way, but within the policy constraints, this is what it could look like. And its most optimal way close as it could be to what your vision is as a client or community, right? But being mindful of those constraints. Thank you so much for sharing. I do see a couple of responses in the chat. Maya responded to question 2. Understanding current policies and regulations help us ensure our designs meet requirements so that they can get permit approvals. Exactly. Funding opportunities like grants are often available to us to help with certain projects. If we align our design to meet the criteria outlining by grants, we can receive more funding for our project. Yes, this is so true. Policies often outline environmental and safety regulations. If we align our design with those policies, we can ensure that we are creating safe spaces that incorporate modern day sustainability practices and technology. Yes, even CEQA, right? Like CEQA requirements, California Environmental Protection, with the California Environmental Quality Act. So it's really managing projects in context of different regulatory requirements to manage environmental protections. And those considerations are super critical to be mindful of in your project. And it just keeps you in compliance of like what best practices are. So yes, being mindful of that is super important. Thanks for sharing that, Maya. We have Melissa in the chat as well. In response to the last question, landscape architects can effectively manage stakeholder expectations throughout the design process to ensure the final intervention meets community needs while balancing regulatory and environmental constraints. By actively listening and communicating with stakeholders, it's crucial to demonstrate that their wants and needs have been heard, even if not all the needs can be met. Stakeholders can feel valued when they know that their voices have been listened to. Transparent decision-making is also essential. Clearly explaining reasons behind decisions is super important, especially when certain requests cannot be accommodated due to regulatory or environmental constraints. Building trust and understanding, yes. And so with that being said, let's say you collect some really great ideas during the idea session that, let's say, can't move forward because of constraints. That can be prepared in a presentation or in the model that we have here. It talks about narrative canvas, the atlas, right? So synthesize information, the story bank or narrative atlas. So a story bank is like, okay, well, we got all these ideas. We were able to prioritize the ones that we had funding for or were in compliance of policy. But these are some really great ideas that the community is really passionate about that could be revisited if funding opportunities come, right? So it's not like you're throwing away all the ideas that you collected that you're not able to move from. You're putting them in a bank for future reference. And oftentimes you can just pick some of those out of that bank and start it in the process all over again, right? And that may be under different conditions. Maybe, the next legislative cycle, a new policy is in place, which allows for some of these ideas that before you weren't able to consider, now you're able to consider under new policies. Or new funding opportunities come. So now you're able to pull some of those ideas into the conversation. Or, there's more interest in it. Maybe the community wasn't as interested in those issues because they had other issues they wanted to prioritize. But now that those issues were able to be addressed, the prioritized issues, now they're able to address some of these other issues that were brought up, right? So all of these things are ways that you can revisit some of those ideas that you collect in the story bank. And the reason why we call it an atlas is because a really great opportunity to do with ideas is map them, right? Along with quantitative data, understanding where the issues exist. You can also map people's narratives. Where are these stories coming from? What part of the city? What community plan areas are being represented in these conversations? And it allows you to say, okay, well, this issue is coming up consistently in this area. It's also reflective of the data that's being collected. We can go ahead and focus priorities there, right? So over time, the priority of these issues can change based off of the ideas and stories that you collect, right? So how are you using the information that you're gathering that, let's say, you're not moving forward with? That's a really great example there. So just keep that in mind. So yeah, so when we're talking about policy windows and really building that alignment, you really want to look at, things that the local government is prioritizing. The Green New Deal, for example, is a legislative priority of the city of Los Angeles related to sustainability goals. There were a lot of initiatives that came out of the Green New Deal. We also been talking a little bit about the LA River Revitalization Plan. So that's another example of a county plan. And then you also have a Good Food Zone as a local initiative that happened here in the city of Los Angeles. So with the Green New Deal, it's a really interesting document because it has sustainability goals over a long period of time, about 10 years, looking at what the city plans to do across multitude of areas, which includes green space, economic opportunity, climate issues, and climate change considerations. And a lot of those initiatives were built around efforts that community-based organizations are currently leading, engagement that they were able to conduct with community organizations who, again, have very intimate and trusting relationships with impacted communities. And so the Green New Deal is very comprehensive, but it also creates opportunities for that alignment piece. So again, community-based organizations who are leading these efforts can be responsive to the city's initiatives in their programs and initiatives that they're conducting as a community-based organizations, which can result in, RFP opportunities with the city in response to some of the priorities that the city is setting. So those are some of the things that you want to consider in regards to how are you aligning policy? Are you aligning it to different reports? Naming these reports in your projects, right? Let's say you're writing up an explanation on why this project is important. You can call it out and say, this project is responsive to the Green New Deal set forth by the city of Los Angeles and its priorities around green space development and addressing economic opportunity in underserved areas, right? So you can really speak to that. And stakeholders will eat that up like cake, right? So that's important. So another example is being able to create visuals to help do this translation. Liz Ugbo was talking about that in her TED Talk about being a translator. So being able to communicate your expectations of your design to the impacted community members and other stakeholders. This is an example of a visual that was created for the Good Food Zone. Let's read it. It says increase access and demand. So these are the goals of the Good Food Zone. The goals of it was to foster healthy supply and demand balance. The Good Food Zone sat at the intersection of racial, health, and economic justice. The goal of the Good Food Zones was to increase access and demand for healthy food in food desert communities. It would increase options for healthy food while building demand for healthy food through culturally relevant practices. And then it also was aiming to promote economic development through food entrepreneurship, right? Help healthy food businesses develop strong business acumen, like managing their produce, because if you don't manage produce, it'll go bad, right? So understanding how to place your produce. There's different chemicals in produce like ethylene that, let's say if you have bananas and tomatoes together, those are have very strong concentrations of ethylene, which help them right? So if you have a vegetable with a lot of ethylene, you want to be able to manage that produce in your shop, right? So they learn about those skills so that as they do start to increase their inventory of healthy food, they can manage it in a way that allows it a profit. And then also supported with scaling their micro business, their healthy enterprise food business operations through resources like grants. So this policy was built in partnership with community-based organizations, community leaders, and similar to, like, let's say a participatory design for a landscape project, being able to facilitate that engagement requires you to be able to coordinate this dynamic visuals of what's happening with the project, what your intended goals of the project is, and help like let's say this visual was built in partnership with community, right? So community came up with content. You may be able to do the visuals, right? But community can come up with the content, help support what some of the goals are, the intended goals are, and you can help build that visual out. So this visual is not only important to communicate, effectively what the intended goals and outcomes are, but it also guides the conversation at the policy or design level, right? To say, okay, as this project moves forward, handing it off, this is what the community is expecting to be accomplished from this, right? And so being able to communicate that effectively is important. And then also you want to be able to communicate your either results or the reason for your demand, right? And that can be done visually. There can be disparity data that you're talking about, like how many communities don't have access to certain resources like parks or healthy food, gardens, right? Different urban landscape gardens. Or you can talk about your results of your project, that as a result of your design, it's going to create economic opportunity for 25 small businesses. It will create educational learning opportunities for youth and adults, right? It will generate $1.5 million of tax revenue for the city. It will create $5,000 of consistent revenue monthly from this site alone for any of the entrepreneurs participating. So whatever those data points are, you really want to be able to communicate that as your intended goals or the results that you've been able to accomplish on your site. And then again, you also want to talk about the disparities, like why your intervention is important to have at that site. So highlighting the different historical harm, the historical significance of challenges that have come up. So that pretty much wraps up our conversation. But again, we talked about it in context of policy, but in context of your design research strategy, the framework is pretty consistent, right? ID your site and regional design constraints and challenges, design constraints, policy constraints, financial constraints, right? And then identifying the social, political, environmental, economic challenges that can come up on your site. And then you use those insights to develop your proposed design intervention. that's what I have for y'all today. We made it to the end of the class today. I will post this online for you all to have access to. I was going to take a little bit of time to go to, have you all ask any questions for your midterm, but we did hit the end of the course. However, I will stay on for any questions that you all have related to your midterm assignments if questions are coming up. They are due this Friday, so I'll be on the lookout for them. I think you're going to do great. But yeah, if folks have any questions regarding your midterm or today's lecture, feel free to stay on. I'll be on for about 5 or 10 minutes. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Always, always a pleasure.